Boy oh boy, where do I begin with this fun computer? So this right here is an HP Apollo 425T with Mentor Graphics branding. A really cool blinking light display. And it's fun. So basically this is a Motorola 68K based Unix workstation. It can run HPUX, it can run BASIC and Pascal with the HPIB connector, and it can also run Domain OS from Apollo. So I got this thing a few years ago. It's Mentor Graphics branded, so when it was new, it was sold with a complete software package, which is now long and lost. And they sold these computers, by the way, with the package. But what happened was, I got this in 2017, I wired a brand new power switch in, and because the original one was completely toasted, and what happened was I got the thing working, but there was one big problem. You know what that problem was? I didn't have a keyboard and mouse, so all I got was the post screen, and I couldn't do anything else. And then recently I found out how to use it with a serial terminal. And even though I got it from 2017, it took me several years because a lot of things happened. I wasted free time away on the internet, and that was a real bad idea, and that's an understatement, to say the least. I ended up getting more computers than I know what to do with, and I messed with those instead. And of course, when I got this, I had a job, then I lost it. And then it took me 2 years to get another job because I was wasting time on the internet, so I didn't have money to get the keyboard. But now I've got this thing fully working, and I'm going to show you what it's like to use this thing through serial mode. So let's take a look around on the back of the machine and see what it can do, because this is a fun computer with a 6840 processor in it, and you'll love to see it. Maybe once I get a keyboard and mouse, I'll show myself taking it apart, but what else can I say? This is a fun computer, and with a lot of interesting history, including HP buying Apollo and whatnot. Alright, enough with the crazy backstory of my life. We can see here there's a Mentor Graphics sticker on here. And that's because Mentor Graphics sold these things for use with Domain OS. They were actually selling Apollo domain workstations before this. And this was designed for use with Domain OS. And what you can see here is there's a video card. It's 1280 by 1024 in 1990, pretty impressive, with 256 colors. We've got our NIC, which is an Apollo domain token ring NIC for Apollo domain networks. This computer came with Apollo domain OS. And what we've got here is a speaker port, HPHIL, a serial port, a SCSI port, an AUI transceiver port, parallel, and then we've got our interesting domain keyboard port. And what that was basically these things could be used with Apollo domain OS. And what that meant was it was a completely different OS with a different keyboard, and I'll go into that in a second when I show you the boot firmware. So this was the first of the HP Apollo workstations, and essentially it was called HP Apollo for a reason. Now HP Apollo, that branding was on the 700 series, but the 400 series has it for a good reason, and that's because HP merged with another computer company called Apollo, or actually they bought Apollo, and they made their own system called Domains, and they ran Domain OS. And the thing with these workstations that ran Domain OS is they had the same processor as HP's other line, the 9300, and I actually have a 9300 380, which is very similar to this, except it can't run Domain OS. And it's more modular, but the 9400 was essentially It was HP's 300 line, and what they did was they merged it with the domain line. So this is a machine that can run both operating systems. The downfall is you need a keyboard to run Domain OS. But one of the things that they inherited from the domain computers was the LED array. Now, domain computers had it was either 4 or 8 LEDs, I forget, I think it was 4, and they would display diagnostics and then the hard disk and the heartbeat. I think they did heartbeat, I don't know, but they had these ABCD lights on that would do certain things depending on the OS, and HPUX used them for heartbeat, hard disk, and network in and out. And there's also the service button. That was inherited from Apollo's as well, because domain systems had a service mode, think like RS6000s, and the service mode would be used to put the system into a special service state for like installing the OS and all that. So let's turn this thing on and I'll show you everything about it. So what we've got here is an Intel Classmate PC netbook. That thing's a story in itself, because the Classmate PC was essentially, let's take a netbook and make a ruggedized version for kids competing with the OLPC laptops. And they sold these to like companies that would sell like Intel desktop board based computers usually, who would then go on and resell them to schools and whatnot. Schools bought tons of these, or they would just go with HP, or they would go with HP, or they would go with Dell or Lenovo making netbooks for kids, and they would buy these for kids. And they actually still make netbooks for schools because schools love netbooks, and that's what most netbooks are made for. They're not $300 anymore, but they're made for schools because of stuff like the Classmate PC still, or Dell and HP making similar laptops. And so what we've got here is a USB to serial adapter, and we're going to flip the thing on right now. So let's go down here. Listen to that nice old fan. Then it starts blinking patterns, and if we go to our monitor, we get the boot screen, and it says type R return for internal console, so we'll do that. And what happens is, I'm going to press, it reboots, and what happens is you look at the HP screen, it clears it, and it says remote console at 9. After beeps, type L return. So basically what it's saying is, what it's saying there is, and I'll show you, what that is saying is that basically, you can basically, if you have a keyboard and mouse hooked up, and you turn the system on, you get a, it can't auto-sense keyboards. So what you have to do is you have to type that command to get into the, to use the monitor as the console. Essentially, this is like RS6000s. I'm going to go to change the settings real quick. We got to change the keyboard to do Control H. And so what we're going to do, now that we've got the system in configuration mode, there's a few options. Number 3 is the most interesting, but for what we're doing now, which is putting the system in serial, we're going to type 1. We're going to type RS242, so 4. We're going to go to 3, and we're going to type R. And we're going to type exit, and we're going to hit store new values. And now the boot firmware is going right through the serial port. So what we are in right now is HP 300 mode, or HPUX mode, but I like to call it HP 300 mode. And that is for one good reason. Right now the system is pretending, or in a mode where it can run software for the HP 9300s. And it's software compatible with it. It can run HPUX. It can run BASIC and Pascal, preferably if you have the HPIB card instead of the, well, it's actually a cable that goes to the outside of the case instead of the domain network card, which this one has. But as we can see here, It says here MD11. That's not the plane. That's actually what Apollo called their boot ROMs, was MD. MD12 was the, for example, MD12 was this with a 6830, and that's why you have to change ROMs if you replace the processor on a 6830 model with an 040 or vice versa. Because this machine actually shipped with a 6830 in it, and it was taken out and replaced with a 6840. And that was something HP did with this model because the 40 wasn't out yet. So they were like, okay, you can buy this now and you can upgrade to the 6840 when it's out by just popping the chip in and changing the boot ROM. And that worked because a lot of these have 6840s instead of 6830s. So also you can see utility chip, not on an HP 300. So those two things are the difference between an HP 300 and a 400, at least in HP 300 mode. We're going to type 1H. Normally it boots, and on this version of the firmware, unlike the older ones, you have to press enter. On the older ones, you would just type it in and it would start booting, but on here you have to press enter. And we've also got 1S, I think that's a system test firmware. So we've got HPUX booting. And we've got a whole list of what's in the computer. And it's doing the usual boot up stuff. Yeah, our time's correct. I actually replaced the clock battery on here and put the Y2K patches in. If you don't put the Y2K patches in, if you do date setting with the script, what will happen is it won't let you enter the current year, and even though you can do it through the command line from what I can tell. But this has the Y2K patches. Console login. So, this is a common screen you'll see on HP 9000s set to boot to serial, and this actually happens a lot more on the Astros, or specifically the blue and gray HPs with the USB keyboard and mouse. When you plug the keyboard in, the firmware doesn't like, it'll actually say it's using the console on the screen on the front of the computer, but nobody checks that, and they go, well, it gave me no video, but then it just gave me this weird screen with just a pointer and some yellow boxes at the bottom, which this machine doesn't have when running it on the 400, but on like HPUX 11 on the Series 700, you'll see 8 yellow boxes at the bottom of the screen. And that's because it's not even using this as a console, even though it detects the video hardware and it's outputting something to it. Instead, you just get a white dot in the corner, and that's all you'll get. I'm going to log in. And that's the thing with these machines. You have to like do all that to get video out. You have to have a keyboard and mouse connected, and it to be in to use a graphical console instead of remote. Now, when you're logging in via local terminal with root, it does this weird thing where it's like, are you using this terminal? No. And so you have to tell it how many lines it is, and then it sets it to this weird 300H value nobody likes. Now let's log in as a user. Also notable on this old Unix is if you log in without setting a xterm, let's do xterm. If you log in without setting up the, what do you call it? The, I'm trying to remember. If you log in with the wrong password, it doesn't automatically wait a few seconds and then tell you the password failed, like on Linux and later Unixes. It just instantly tells you login incorrect. And I think they added that in later to like try to keep people from brute forcing passwords. But we're on HPUX on Motorola 68000, and I've even set up GCC. What is it? GCC-V. There we go. I've got GCC version 295.3 on here. There's actually a complete GCC file on BitSavers. And type in Emacs. Oh, whatever. let me do ls. And we type that in, and we get that text editor via serial on a 68,000. Fun, isn't it? So how do I quit? Yeah, Control X, Control C. So let's reboot this, and I'll show you a few more interesting features about the boot ROM. And if you type init3 in, it will actually start VUE for remotely logging into the system, so you can actually remotely use VUE or View without having a keyboard and mouse, which is pretty cool if you ask me, because you don't need a keyboard and mouse to get this thing going in HP 300 mode at least. Domain OS is another story, and I'll show you why. So boot mode selection is what sets this apart from a Series 300. You can choose HPUX compatible, which basically makes it an HP 300, or you can choose domain compatible. So let's push 1, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the front of the machine. And I'm going to push, oh whoops, I'm going to push service, and let's go back here. And let's go to 3, 1, T. And let's hit E. So what happens there is, when we press enter, we get the Apollo domain MD-ROM. And it actually has a help function as well. See? Which is deceiving because you think maybe I can boot and install Domain OS somehow on this system without having to seek out one of those Apollo domain keyboards. Now the thing with Apollo domain systems is that they were designed so, you know, basically if you bought this thing as a Apollo system, you could change over to HPUX by removing the radically different keyboard, plugging in an HP HIL keyboard, and using that with this machine instead. And that is what a lot of people who kept these things in operation for years and years probably did once HP killed Domain OS. They switched it over to HPUX mode, and they got rid of the keyboards, threw it in a closet until they threw it out, and then they switched over to HPUX, which used the vastly more common HP HIL keyboard, and they ran that instead. So the thing is, it was a good idea in practice, but the problem is years later it's a pain, and I'll show you why. So in service mode they designed it so any keyboard works, so you could put your HP HIL keyboard in and use that to get into HPUX mode. But what happens when we turn off service mode? Well, see, it says remote console at 9 still. Let's change the front of it. Let's turn off service mode. And it's going into the boot ROM as usual. Let's go to C. And when it's doing the memory test, you can't do that easily. Let's go to 3, 1, T. And let's execute it. So what happens when we do it without a keyboard connected and service mode's off is it completely ignores what's on the screen and it starts doing its little self-test. And it ignores the fact that we have serial set up. So what it's doing is it's trying to boot, but the problem is there's nothing on the screen. It's just trying to find and boot the system as if a keyboard was connected, even though it says there's no keyboard. And this is why I'm like, oh crap, I'm not going to be able to do this until someone makes an adapter, will I? So it's doing all the self-tests, which these Apollo systems, when they're in Apollo mode, they do a much more in-depth self-test. Instead of the basic self-test HP 9000s do in HP 9000 mode. See, and it even tells us that there's going to be no keyboard. And it still doesn't try to switch it over here. We can press enter, we can type R, enter, nothing. It will not do anything. And this is the problem with trying to use this system in domain mode without a keyboard and mouse. It just won't work. So we're going to flip this thing off. And yeah, there you have it, a quick video of the HP 9400 series. Maybe in another video I'll probably end up taking this thing apart once I get a keyboard and mouse for it, but until then I wanted to show you what I've been working on in the basement. It's a pretty interesting machine, and I'm glad I finally have a full working 68,000 Unix box. Alright, and for one last clip to close the video out, I'm just going to turn this thing back on and show you what the LED patterns do. So without further interruption, let's do it. Doing self-tests, it's already started outputting to the console and video. So you get a nice row of blinking lights. God, it's hard to keep this camera stable. So now it's doing the whole system search thing. And what it's going to do is it's going to find and boot HPUX. So right now it's doing that. And the firmware quits displaying anything. You can hear the beep of HPUX. And now what happened is A and B are the network LEDs. D is the heartbeat LED, I think. And C is the hard disk. And E, F, G, H are the load indicators. So right now there's no load on the system, it's just blinking. As there's load, C and D really start to flash, especially C. And E, F, G, H are displaying that the system's under heavy load. Which is pretty cool to see a load indicator on the system. Beep, beep. And now as the service has finally come up, there's still a bit of things it's doing in the background, but the load lights are out now, and we are at the login screen. And that's it for this video. I'll probably make another one once I get a keyboard and mouse, but thank you for watching this. Subscribe for more, and stay safe out there in these trying times. Everything's bad now. World events, the internet, the virus, all that stuff is horrible. And I think the best way to deal with it is to actually do some fun stuff with these old computers. So there you have it. And we're at the empty frame buffer screen because there's nothing to display because it's on serial. So there you have it.